deploying operating systems. All right, and so up until this point in this series, we've had a lot of different examples and a lot of different demos that we've put together, and really a lot of those demos have been relatively trivial up to this point. The process of deploying operating systems using Configuration Manager is not necessarily complex, but there are a lot of different pieces that have to fit together just so for this process to work. And what we're going to do is talk about that process of fitting all those pieces together and all the different components that you need and to successfully capture an existing operating system's image and then later deploy that image to other systems. We're going to be using WinPE, or the Windows pre-installation environment, as the mechanism for doing that. If you're familiar with the old blue screen of installation that we used to have in older operating systems, the Windows pre-installation environment is a much slicker, much cleaner way of actually getting operating systems installed from our environment onto other machines in our environment. We're also going to talk a little bit about the WIM format, and this is the Microsoft format for OS images. It's WIM, the Windows Image Management format, and what this does is, if you're familiar with the semantic ghost tool and the .gho files that essentially captured all the files and configurations and everything that made up a server into one single file, that's more or less the same tool that we're using here with the WIM format. And Configuration Manager uses WIM formats for not only boot and not only install, but also capture images to actually do the things that are necessary in order to grab images and then deploy them out in other places. We have three different types of images that we'll be talking about here. The first is actually the boot image, which is Windows PE, and that will actually boot the server so that we can prepare it for either capturing an image or deploying an image. We have the install and the capture images as well that do just that. We use those images once we've booted to actually bring an image back or consolidate an image off of an existing reference server and then later deploy it to other computers as well. And so we're going to talk about the process of actually creating capture images and also installing those images once created to other computers. We do that using a thing called task sequences. And if you're familiar with old SMS 2003 and the OSD feature pack and SMS 2003, there were some complexities there, and I think you'll find that task sequences in Configuration Manager 2007 are significantly easier to use. In fact, they're pretty slick in the way they set up the order in which items are completed as part of the OS deployment. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the PXE site system role and how you can use the PXE site system role to have machines that are on the network use PXE to download the boot image and leverage some of your OS deployment through that tool. So let's start by actually minimizing this here, and we're going to go back to our Configuration Management console where we're seeing the operating system deployment node that we've highlighted here. And if we expand this OS deployment node here, you'll notice that we have a number of different elements underneath the node. We talked about the boot images. These boot images are actually used to boot candidate machines. We're going to talk about computer association a little bit later. We also have operating system images that are the OS images that we may use to deploy operating systems to other computers. We also have install packages, which are the other bits that are used to assist with the installation of that media as well. We talked about task sequences as well, and these are the sequences of activities that have to occur, the sequences of tasks that have to occur to complete a disk capture or to complete an OS deployment, those sorts of things. And then we also have drivers and driver packages here, and these are used if our image does not have the right drivers in it that are important for the machine that we're either trying to pull an image from or push an image to. We can inject drivers into that image if necessary, and then all of the drivers are going to be available for us, so we don't really have any problems with our image installation process. Now, the entire process that we have to go through in order to actually get an image, process that image, and then deploy that image out to other systems is multi-steps. There's a lot of steps involved with the process. And the way that Configuration Manager does it is arguably could be considered somewhat odd, but if you think about it in a long term, if you think about it as you'll be using these images over an extended period of time, it actually makes a lot of sense. The process by which Configuration Manager and the OS deployment part of Configuration Manager actually goes through capturing an image is for an existing machine that is sitting on your network. Let's say you have a machine that's out there, it's got the Configuration Manager client already on it. We actually deploy an operating system to that machine. We deploy the packages, the software that we want to deploy to that machine, any configurations that we want to deploy to that machine. Once we have then gone through the process of essentially rebuilding that machine into a pristine state, then we capture that image. And so for us to actually capture an image, we actually have to, in some ways, deploy an image first. And so as we'll go through this process, just be thinking about how you would configure your golden images for actually later deployment whenever you have to go and deploy them out to various machines in your network. Now, the very first thing that we have to do is here under software distribution. In order for us to deploy anything, we actually have to deploy also the configuration manager client so that we can then interact with that over the period of time, over the entire period of capturing and then deploying it. And so if we go under here under packages and we right click and choose a new package and choose a new package from definition, you'll notice, but by default, with the default installation of Configuration Manager, we have a package definition for the Configuration Manager client upgrade. This is the client upgrade as well as the client installation, and so this is necessary for us to be able to deploy the client to machines as we begin this capture process. So I click Next here, and we're going to actually create a package from this definition wizard. It's very important that we actually create that package and also link to its files that are in a source directory. And so I click Next here, and it's going to ask us where are those files and what source directory they're going to be in. And for you, by default, that source directory is going to be under Entire Network and Windows Network and Nugget Lab and sccm Nugget. And under SMS and then your site code, look for the client folder. This is going to be by default. You'll see there are 3 subfolders here, but don't go into any of these particular subfolders. Under the client subfolder are going to be the locations that you need in order to create this package and appropriate and point it to the right location for its source files. We click Next and Finish, and it automatically creates this package for us. We're going to use this package as part of the capture process and later on as part of the installation process as well. Now that we've done this, I actually want to step you through a number of the different elements that we need to put together in order for us to do an image capture. Now, the very first thing we need to do under boot images here is take a look at the various boot images that we already have imported into the interface. You'll see here that I've already imported in a boot image for x64 and a boot image for x86. These are Vista boot images that we will use actually to boot the pre-installation environment for Windows Vista. If we go and right-click and choose properties of these boot images here, we can see some information about the image. We can see that this is OS version 6 here. This is Microsoft Windows Vista PE. We can see some information about Windows Vista here. If there are drivers that we need to ingest that we've already pre-populated down here into the drivers node, we can do so here. If we want to enable the support for the command prompt, we can enable the support for the command prompt by checking this box, which allows us to interface with that WinPE environment as opposed to using the GUI tools that are available to us as part of Windows PE. Remember that Windows PE is not a full version of the operating system, and so we don't necessarily have all the things that we would normally have in a regular operating system. We have the ability to change the Windows PE background. We can use the default background or choose one of our own choosing. We have the data source information here, which is what the image path is. You'll see here that I've copied it to the OSD folder, boot i8-386, boot.win location. And then we have an index associated with the image. We can have multiple images that make up one single WIM file here. Same thing with the rest that we see before with other packages as well, data access, distribution settings, security. These are all no different than what we've seen before. These are actually the boot images that we've created in order to boot a candidate workstation for any sort of activity, whether that be capture or deployment or anything that we need to do as part of the OSD deployment process. You'll see here that because we've made a change, we check that one box. In order for us to enable that change, anytime we make any change whatsoever to the configuration, we need to update the distribution points associated with this boot image. And so when we update those distribution points, the distribution points get the information that is necessary in order for them to be able to deploy out those changes as well. If I click Yes here, that will automatically update the distribution points for me. I can click Next here, and it's going to process the change to those distribution points. And when it's done, we'll be returned with the little green checkboxes here that show us that we've actually had success for all the elements that we've done. And whenever we're doing this, we always want to keep an eye out for these little green checkboxes because that lets us know that we've had success for all the activities that we've attempted to do. Now you'll see here we have an x86 and an x64 boot image, and that's specifically for Windows Vista. If we want to add additional boot images, we can do that as well by right-clicking and choosing to add a boot image. When we add the boot image, we can add that boot image in from perhaps the Windows DVD media. We can do it from the Windows Server 2008 DVD media, for example. I'm going to navigate to sccm Nugget, and then the CD location. This is literally a UNC path that I've created, a share that I've created to the CD drive on this server. And if we navigate to this location, you'll see the sources location. The sources subfolder is where the WIM files are stored, not only the boot WIM file for booting the system, but also install.wim, which is the other file that is used for actually installing the operating system. If we go to source here, if we go to sources here, and we hit the backslash, we look for boot.wim. You'll see this is another boot.wim image that we could potentially add into our configuration configuration manager instance if we want to. Once we click boot.wim, then we can check the checkbox here to show us whether we're interested in downloading perhaps the Windows Longhorn WinPE or the Windows Longhorn setup, for example. We can click this as well and choose next, and then give it a name, version, and comment. In this case, I'm not going to actually add this image, but I want to just show you the process for adding additional images. For example, if you wanted to create additional images for booting Windows Server 2008 or other operating systems that are available. Now, the other thing we have to do is actually create an operating system image as well. And you'll see here that I've already imported in an operating system image for Windows Vista Business. If we right-click and choose Properties for this operating system image here, you'll see that more or less just like the other image that we looked at, we can view some information about this image. You'll notice that the particular WIM file that I've imported directly off of the Windows Vista DVD, actually native to it, has 7 different images that are within its WIM file. If I go look at that install.wim file that's sitting on the DVD, that install.wim file actually can install Vista in 7 different configurations. And this allows me the ability to install any one of those configurations from the same WIM file. And in fact, I want to show you actually what this WIM file looks like so you can get a view of what it looks like. If we go here to Run, and we go to d:/sources, just like we talked about before, and inside of this sources location, we're going to see the boot.wim file. That is actually the Windows PE environment that we talked about just a minute ago. And then we're also going to look for install.wim. You'll see install.wim here, as well as some additional CLG files associated with it. This install.wim file is the actual, the blob, more or less, that within this blob exists all of the installation bits that are needed to install Windows Vista and any of its different editions onto a particular target machine. And so once we port to this install.wim, it'll actually allow us to enumerate the different editions that are sucked up into this location. You'll see right here, and right now we're choosing Windows Vista Business, but we could choose any one of these as necessary. And there are some individual properties that are associated with that as well. Under data source, it's the same thing. Where are we actually storing this location? I'm storing under the source files, Windows Vista x86 media sources location. The other stuff is essentially the same as it was before. So this is the actual media, the actual bits and bytes that we would use to install Windows Vista Business onto a target machine. Again, just like before, if we wanted to add a new operating system image, we could do so by right-clicking and choosing Add Operating System Image. From here, we would choose an example path again. Perhaps I go sccm nugget cd sources and then install.wim. Again, this is the Windows Vista DVD media, but I could do the Windows Server 2008 DVD media or anything else as necessary, any other operating system as necessary, as long as I have the location to its .wim file. I choose the next, I give it name, version, and comment, and then it'll actually import and ingest this operating system image into Configuration Manager for later use. Again, just like before, I'm going to cancel out of this because I don't want to add this image, but this is the process you would use to add operating system images into your Configuration Manager infrastructure. Now, you don't necessarily have to use the default WIM files that are actually stored on the media. You can create your own WIM files. You can use other tools like ImageX to create your own image files, or you can capture your own image files just like we're about to talk about here in a second. All of those files have a .wim extension, and all of those are used for deploying that operating system, whether it be configured or whether it be the vanilla operating system that is available right off the DVD. Now, in addition to the operating system itself, the image itself, we also have some other stuff that's required in order for us to install that package, and we do so here under Operating System Install Packages. These are everything else, more or less, that's sitting on the DVD that is necessary for us to actually install a version of an operating system. And you'll see here I've already automatically imported in, or I've already imported in before we started the recording, an operating system install package based off of the Vista media here. If we choose the properties here, just like we've seen before, we can see the general information here. We can see some additions information here as well, and the data source information where I'm storing this to Vista x86 media. I got this by right-clicking onto Operating System Install Packages and choosing to add an install package, and effectively going to / sccm nugget and looking at the CD itself and going into the root of the CD file. If I go into the root of the CD file here, that'll actually give me all the rest of the bits on the CD that allow me to complete the installation of this image as necessary for the future steps down the road. I can give it a name, I can give it a version, I can give it a comment, etc. In this case, I'm going to click cancel again because I have the bits and bytes I need to be able to successfully install Vista at this point. Now the next thing we want to look at is actually drivers. If you've ever had to install images and tried to install an image across multiple different hardware classes, you've been aware of the situation where sometimes you don't have the drivers in the installer to correctly be able to put those drivers in the image. Maybe you've got newer hardware, and the newer hardware has different sorts of driver requirements that are available in the native Windows Vista default installation. In that case, you actually need to create a driver set, or in this case what we call a driver package, for injecting those drivers into the installation so that they correctly install as part of the OS installation. Now, if we click here under drivers, you'll see we don't have any drivers currently installed, but if we right-click on drivers and choose to import, we can actually import existing drivers that are available to us. Now, drivers, by default, when the hardware manufacturer creates a driver set, they create more or less a package of the driver and then some .inf files that are used to actually instruct the operating system how to install those drivers. As an example, I'm going to show you a location on the Windows Vista DVD media that actually has an existing set of drivers that we can use to show how this process works. You'll see here up in the top button we can choose to install all the drivers in the following network path. That allows us to have more or less one folder that has all of the drivers for a particular image or a particular piece of hardware that we may deploy this image to in one location and suck them all in at once because they're all in that same location. Or we can choose to import a specific driver by specifying the source path to its INF file or its txtsetup.oem file. So in this case, we can do a single driver one at a time as necessary. In this case, I want to show you how we can do multiple drivers at once by going again to the sccm nugget /cd and /sources location. In that location are going to be a number of INF files that relate to existing drivers that are on that Windows Vista DVD media. If I click the next button, it's going to interrogate that media and it's going to find a number of drivers that are available to us. These drivers may be for various things like network cards or for video cards or for anything really that makes up the system that we need a specific driver for. You'll see that we can choose to enable these drivers and allow computers to install them. We need to be able to do this so that we can actually use them as part of an operating system installation, and then we can apply them to a particular category if necessary. Maybe we want to add a new category of directly on Vista media, for example, and we can add that to the list of available categories, for example. And what this will do is this will import those drivers into our configuration manager instance and then allow us to add them into a single package. That single package allows us to ingest those into our images as we deploy them. You'll see now that once we have the driver details, we can add that driver to specific packages as well. If we want to create a new driver package, we can click the button here and say Vista default drivers. We can put a comment in here if necessary, and then we can provide a package source as necessary as well. In this case, the package source is going to be the location where we're just going to store those drivers. If we click Browse here, we click Browse and go to Entire Network here, and we scroll down through Windows Network and Nugget Lab and then sccm Nugget. And in sccm Nugget, we have this source files location. Let's create a new folder here called Drivers and put that driver package in the driver's location, for example. This is going to go ahead and create the package for us, and we can then update the distribution points as necessary when we're finished so that we can then make use of those drivers as necessary. In this case, I'm going to uncheck this so we don't have to wait for the process to complete that distribution point update. I click Next here, and then if we want to, we can also directly add that driver into existing boot images as necessary. Now, if you think about it, thus far we've talked about the process of injecting the drivers in for the installation once we've installed the OS onto the system. But in some cases, the actual boot image, the WinPE image that we need in order to be able to boot the machine, to get an image onto that machine, may also need that driver as well. So if there's a piece of hardware that it's not natively understood by those boot images, we can use this mechanism to inject that driver into the boot image and then have that so that the boot image actually boots successfully and allows us to do what we need to and what is necessary. In this case, I'll leave these unchecked so we don't actually inject those into the boot images and click Next here. It's going to give us a summary page that tells us all the things that we're about to do, and we click Next, and it's going to actually take those drivers, bring them out of one location, and store them into our source files location. And we're back. And the drivers that we've used in this example are not necessarily functional drivers meant to install anything into a system, but they give you an example of the process that is used actually to create a driver package here. You'll see we've created this driver package. And so we can use the drivers that we've ingested into this package as part of that installation image or boot image to actually make that system boot up and do the things that we necessarily need it to be able to do. And now with this step, we've actually completed enough of the components, of configuring the components that we need to fit together in order for us to be able to do some function with operating system deployment. And for us to actually perform that function, we're going to do that from within here under task sequences. And a task sequence, as we talked about before, is a mechanism by which you can create an action or a list of actions that accomplishes something, whether that be deploying an image or capturing an image or even some custom sorts of things. If we right-click task sequences and choose new task sequence, you'll see here that we have the option of installing an existing image package, or building and capturing a reference operating system image, or even creating a new custom task sequence to do something to an operating system that we want to do target for some reason. In this case, let's say that we don't necessarily yet want to capture an image. We just want to deploy the plain vanilla Windows Vista operating system, and we want to deploy that right to a system. In this case, we can choose install an existing image package here and choose the next button and give that a task sequence name, and then so we can say deploy vanilla Vista. In this case, we would give it a boot image as well, and this is the image that we would need in order to be able to boot that system to deploy that package. In this case, we'll say boot image x86 because this is an x86 workstation that we would deploy this to. Once we've done that, we choose the next button here, and then we can choose what sort of package that we want to actually deploy to that system. If we choose browse here, you'll see that we have one package, and that again is the default right off the DVD installation that we want to install for Windows Vista Business RTM. In this case, we choose OK. We can choose whatever image we want. Maybe it's Home Basic or Home Premium. And in our case, we'll just choose Business in this case. And we can choose to partition and format the target computer before installing the operating system. This tells us, okay, do we want to format the C drive? Do we want to partition it in various ways before we install the OS, or just use the existing partitions that are available on that system as it were before we started the process? We can enter in a product key if we want through here. This is the 25-digit product key associated with Windows Vista, and a server licensing mode if we have that. We can disable or always use the same administrator password for when we do these deployments. In this case, I can throw a password in here and copy the password to confirm it and choose next. The next thing we can do is choose if we want this machine after we're complete to be a part of a work group or part of a domain. If we choose the domain, we need to choose the domain and the OU in the domain to actually deploy that to, and also an account that has permission to join that workstation. In our case, let's just do that as part of a work group, because we'll install this machine to a work group and maybe later add it to a domain, for example. We need to install Configuration Manager to that machine. For us to be able to manage that machine so it doesn't get orphaned from our Configuration Manager infrastructure, we need to be able to install the Configuration Manager client and have that machine part of the infrastructure so we can further manage it. We choose the Browse button here and install our Configuration Manager client upgrade package. This is way, way, way back in the beginning of this nugget. We talked about this package that we needed to have, and this was the creating that package from the definition. We need that because we need to be able to deploy that package as stated to any machines that we create using OS deployment. If we choose the next button here, we have the option of capturing user settings using the user state migration toolkit. We're not going to talk about the use of the USMT here, but just be aware that you have the ability using Configuration Manager to actually capture existing user settings off of a machine and then replace those user settings onto the machine after it's been upgraded as part of the user state migration tool. You'll need to create a package just like we did with the Configuration Manager client and assign that here, capture the user settings, and then also later deploy those user settings as necessary. We're going to unselect this at this point. We can also capture the network settings and any Microsoft Windows specific settings as necessary as part of this state migration toolkit. We'll choose next here. If we have software update services or WSS set up in our environment, or if we're using Configuration Manager to deploy software updates, as we'll talk about in a later nugget, we can actually deploy those software updates right away immediately to that deployed OS as part of the initial OS deployment. You'll see here we can choose mandatory software updates, we can choose all software updates, or we can choose not to install any software updates as necessary. I'll choose not to at this point because we haven't really talked about software updates at this point, but if you have that infrastructure in place, you can more or less ensure that laptops or desktops as you deploy them, or even servers as you deploy them, get deployed with all the software updates as necessary. Which is next here. We can also, as part of this package that we're creating, this task sequence that we're creating, install over the top or layer over the top of that default OS additional software packages to be run with that OS image. Now, if you think about this, if you've had the problem before with OS images and having lots and lots and lots of images that you've had to manage because this image has Word, and this image has Excel, and this image has Acrobat, and this image has this and that and the other thing, you know that one of the big issues with images is the problem associated with having to manage all the applications that are in those images. Well, with Configuration Manager, you can deploy more or less a base image that doesn't have anything on it at all, and then layer the software over the top. In this case, case, we choose the little star button here, and we can choose a package that is available inside of our infrastructure to deploy to that machine after the operating system has completed. In our case, we have Adobe Acrobat that we've already packaged in a previous nugget. If we deploy that package will be part of the operating system, be part of that machine when we run this task sequence against that machine. We click the next button here, and we get a summary of all the tasks that we're about to accomplish as part of this task sequence, and click the next button again. It creates the task sequence, and you'll see here we all got all the green check boxes here, so we've done everything correctly, and then we hit the close button. You'll see here now we have the ability to deploy the vanilla version of Windows Vista, and Windows Vista Business to be specific. If we right-click this and choose the Edit command, we can actually go in to that task sequence editor and do more specific configuration of that task sequence as we need to make sure it's configured appropriately for our environment. We have first the capturing of files and settings on that machine. We're capturing Windows settings here, computer name, registered user and organization name, maybe even time zone name information. For anything, we have the options to disable steps or add conditions that tell that step when and when not to occur. And you'll see this option tab for all of the various things that we're going to be going through here in the sequence editor. We have the option to choose when those options are going to occur or when those steps are going to occur. Same thing down here with network settings. We have the ability to migrate the network settings from the old to the new machine as well, and the options to choose when we would disable this step or what conditions are associated that we would need to do in order to do or not do those steps as well. Once we've done that, we can install the operating system. We can restart inside of Windows PE. You'll see we have other options here. All of these, every time we have a different action that's associated within this editor, there are going to be properties associated with those actions that we're going to want to watch to make sure that we're doing it correctly. In this case, one of the options we have is notify the user before we actually restart their machine. We have a notification message here that we may want to provide to that user. We can partition the disks as necessary. We can choose what disk number and what standard disk types we want, or what volumes we want to create. We can choose how we want to check the properties of those volumes and what percentage of free space we want to make available and what's the boot partition, etc., etc. If we cancel out of here, you'll see we can apply the operating system. We can apply a Windows settings to the operating system, network settings as well to that operating system as far as work group and domain. These are all things that we've sort of in the initial wizard actually configured, but this gives us more additional configuration control associated with all of these steps for the initial operating system. You'll see that we can set up that operating system where we set up Windows and we set up the configuration manager part of Windows as well. And then any software that we indicated in that wizard is now brought into this task sequence editor. For example, you'll see here the Acrobat installation that we can do as well. If we choose the Add button here, we can actually add a number of additional steps as necessary if we want to add those steps into this task sequence. Maybe we want to run a command line or install a piece of software or updates or join a domain or work group. Maybe we want to format or partition the disk or do something with user state, or perhaps we want to apply an OS image or a data image or do some preparation sorts of tools, or maybe deal with drivers, or we want to apply drivers or apply a driver package as we talked about just a few minutes ago if there are drivers that we may need to add into that package or additional settings as necessary. And so we have a very rich interface here for us to be able to deploy this operating system image using this task sequence. And if you're familiar with the old way and the Server 2003 and SMS 2003 and how the OSD feature pack actually did this, you'll probably be very happy with how this task sequence editor really gives you a step-by-step approach to how each action is involved with the deployment of an operating system. Go ahead and click OK here. Now that we've actually created a task sequence, we therefore then need to actually deploy that task sequence to a machine or to a collection of machines within our configuration manager infrastructure. If we have a machine that is currently active in the configuration manager infrastructure, we can then deploy this task sequence to it by right-clicking and choosing Advertise. And so this allows us to really advertise this just like we would with a package, but in this case we're advertising the task sequence to some number of machines on our network. We can choose the task sequence here. We can browse for that. We can browse for a collection as well. These are the available collections available to us. In some cases, we may want to create new collections, or we may want to create static collections so that we're not, for example, deploying this task sequence to all Windows Server systems and rebooting all of our Windows Server systems and rebuilding them all at once. So be very, very careful with how you deploy these task sequences, because you can cause yourself a lot of pain if you deploy them to the wrong location. Let's say here we have systems with Word 2007 installed. Maybe that's a collection that we created in a previous nugget. We want to deploy this task sequence and this upgrade process to those client systems. So we click OK here, and this will actually deploy that this task sequence to those machines. We can make this task sequence available to boot media and also to Pixie as well. Keep this in the back of your mind because we're going to talk about Pixie in just a little bit. At this point, for us to be able to make use of this upgrade, to make use of this OS deployment, the machine has to be up and operational and with the SMS client on, the Configuration Manager client installed. We have other options as well, that being boot media and also Pixie boot as well, for us to be able to deploy this. And we're going to show you how to do that here in a second. We can click the next button here and we can choose advertisement start and stop time. There's nothing new here that we haven't seen before. We can choose a mandatory start time so we can deploy it as soon as possible. We can enable wake on LAN and ignore maintenance windows, for example, and allow the system to restart outside those maintenance windows. So the multiple restarts that occur as part of the OS deployment can actually occur without any problems. We can choose the next button here, and we always want to make sure that we choose to access the content directly from a distribution point, especially in the case if we're doing, for example, user state migration or any time that we're actually, really any time that we're doing any sort of OS deployment, because we don't want to deploy the content down and then have one of the task sequences associated with, for example, formatting and repartitioning the drive, actually delete the content that was just brought down. So in this case, let's always make sure that we choose to access the content directly from a distribution point as well. We can choose how we want to choose distribution points here with local distribution points or remote or protected or non-protected distribution points as well. Do we want to allow users to run the program independently, etc., etc., etc. All of these are the same thing that we're used to seeing before with the creation of an advertisement, but this in this case, we're not advertising a package. As I said before, we're advertising this task sequence. When the clients pick this up, when the clients receive this new advertisement, they're going to process this advertisement based on the schedule that we've deployed, and over a period of time, we'll begin the installation process of that new operating system, just like it would the installation process of a regular package. So let's go ahead and cancel this wizard because we don't want to really deploy this to all of the machines that have Word 2007 in our environment, but we want to show you that in addition to deploying this package, there are also two other ways that we can actually run the package or initiate the package on the part of the client. The first is through the use of bootable media. If we right-click here and choose Create Task Sequence Media here, this allows us to create standalone media, bootable media, or even capture media associated with actually getting this task sequence deployed out to a machine. Let's say, for example, we want to create a bootable media that accesses the Configuration Manager infrastructure. We can choose bootable media here and choose Next, and then we can choose what sorts of media we want to create. Maybe we want to create an ISO file, for example. We want to choose a CD, DVD set for booting up to the Windows pre-installation environment. If we do that, we can then choose a location for storing this media file. Perhaps I want to store it in a location called image capture media, for example. In that case, we can go deploy Vista, and we'll create that with the .iso extension. When we do that, we're actually creating an ISO file that then we can later on then burn to a CD or burn to a DVD to actually put the DVD in the drive, boot the DVD from the drive, and then bam, you're off to the races with beginning the process of deploying the OS. We can protect that media with a password, for example, so that if someone actually steals that media, they can't take that media and use it to boot and automatically begin rebuilding machines all across of our infrastructure. We can create self-signed media certificates, or we can import certificates if we're in native mode as well. In this case, we won't do either of those. And then lastly, we can specify the boot image that will be run within the media. In this case, we choose Browse, and the boot image we want is the x86 boot image to boot from sccm Nugget. In this case, what we're actually doing is creating this ISO file, and this ISO file is going to boot this boot image and then give us the option to look at what sorts of task schedules are available on the sccm Nugget distribution point, and then choose from them and then actually deploy the operating system. And so it makes it very, very easy for us in the case that we don't necessarily have the Configuration Manager client sitting on a machine. Now, if you think about it, for existing machines that are already in our infrastructure, they probably have the Configuration Manager client already existing on those machines. For those that are brand new, they're coming right out of the box, they probably don't. And so this boot media allows us to put the CD in the drive or the DVD in the drive and actually boot from the media and send that package all the way down, that task sequence all the way down to begin the OS installation process. So in this case, I'm going to click cancel here so you can see this gives you an idea of how to use task sequence media to create bootable media for the process of actually deploying an image. But if DVDs really aren't your cup of tea, there are another mechanism that you can use to actually do this image distribution, and that's Pixie booting. And if you know what Pixie booting is, it's the screen that pops up whenever the BIOS and the CMOS are booting inside of your workstation, and you hit the F12 button and it boots to Pixie. It goes off to a Pixie server somewhere and downloads whatever it needs to be able to jumpstart or bootstrap itself. And that is another mechanism that we can use also to interface between the client and also our Configuration Manager server as well. We actually do that by adding a a site system role to our existing server. If I scroll through the site management node and go to site systems here, you can see for sccm Nugget we want to actually add a new role to sccm Nugget, and that new role, if we click down here on the next button, that new role that we want to add is actually the Pixie service point. The Pixie service point allows this configuration management server to actually respond to incoming Pixie requests. As you'll see here, when a Pixie client actually attempts to contact us Pixie server, it does so over a certain number of ports, and those ports actually need to be opened up for us to be able to use them. In this case, it's UDP 67, 68, 69, and 4011. So we're going to go ahead and open up these ports so that we can continue enabling the Pixie service point on this system. You'll see here now that we can allow this Pixie service points to respond to incoming Pixie requests. So when a client actually hits that F12 and begins requesting for information from an available Pixie server, it will do that. We can require a password for computers that boot into Pixie so that we can prevent anyone from accidentally automatically upgrading or rebuilding their system. And then we can respond to Pixie requests either across all network interfaces or across specific network interfaces by MAC address. So this gives us some ability to limit down to just what clients that we want actually have the ability to integrate in with the Pixie server. We click the next button here. I'm going to go ahead and remove the password requirement here. We click the next button here, and that takes us to the next screen that allows us to choose what sorts of accounts we want to use to interface with the database. So the Pixie service point actually needs to integrate with the configuration manager database to understand what it needs to do. And for us to be able to do that, we can use the Pixie service point's computer account or another account, and then we may necessarily need to use a self-signed certificate or an existing certificate, especially if we have that native mode for our configuration manager infrastructure. If we choose the next button here, that'll actually allow us to continue and add the Pixie service point role to our site server. Now you'll see that we've completed. This site server will now begin listening for Pixie client requests, and when it sees those Pixie client requests, provide an ability for those clients to be able to download and operate complete operating system deployment based on the configurations that you've set inside of Configuration Manager. So this is really the process for deploying an image to an available client in our infrastructure. As you can see, it's actually relatively trivial. There's a lot of pieces and bits that you have to link in together to make it function. However, in some cases, you may want to create more customized WIMs. You may want to create more customized task schedules. You may want to capture an existing, capture a system and then use that so it all deploys in one fell swoop without having to layer things over the top. In that case, we can actually create a capture image and use that capture image to deploy our operating system, to deploy all the changes that we want to make to the configuration, and deploy all the applications. And so we create more or less our reference machine, our golden image. And then once we have that golden image in the way that we want to, we then suck it back in. We capture it and suck it back into our configuration manager infrastructure so that we can deploy it at once, as opposed to having all these layered effects associated with it. And as you'll understand, the process to actually create a capture image is more or less exactly the same as creating a regular deployment, except at the very end it actually does this capture thing that sucks that image back into our infrastructure. If I right click here under task sequences and choose a new task sequence, and instead of installing an existing image package, I want to build and capture a reference operating system image, you'll see here that the task sequence information that I'm about to create is more or less exactly the same as what I had done before with actually deploying a system. In this case, I want to capture an image as opposed to deploying one, and I need to create a boot image just like before that's x86, and I need to install Windows, and I need to install a vanilla version of Vista onto that machine so that I can then customize it later on and capture the network, maybe join it to a work group, for example, just like before, and install Configuration Manager just like I did before. As you'll see, all of these are relatively the same as deploying that image. The only difference is that at the very end, I'm going to then capture whatever changes I've made and then suck it up. The idea here is that instead of actually having to create a machine, instead of actually having to manually create the machine and manually add the operating system and manually add the applications and the configurations, what I'm doing is I'm scripting that process. By scripting that process, then to change that capture, all I need to do then is literally change the script. I don't have to go and rebuild the machine and make all the mistakes that I would normally make, or miss things, or have to write down all of the configuration steps that I would normally need to, because I don't need to have the reference image existing. I just need to have the script that creates the reference image and then captures that. So in this case, we may have some software packages we want to add. We may have some other configurations we want to add to that system so that we can actually create that golden image as necessary. I'll click next here. We can choose sysprep if necessary, and this is Vista, so it doesn't require a sysprep tool. We may have some image properties we want to add, and then we can create the capture image. Where do we want to save it to? We can save it to sccm nugget / source files, for example, / image capture media, and then perhaps there's this, not image capture media, to Vista 86 OS image. And then from there, maybe I want to put it inside of that Vista 86 OS image. Maybe this is my customized Vista location, for example. So this is a location where I can actually put this in. I can use this account to actually access that folder. In this case, it'll be nuggetlab-administrator, and then I need to give it a password. And then apply the password the second time and choose OK here. This is what is used once that image is deployed to actually get back into that folder that I want to create inside of my Configuration Manager infrastructure. I click Next here. Here's the summary. I click Next again, and you'll see we have all the green checkboxes here necessary so that you know we'll have a successful task sequence. When I click Close here, I go back to my task sequences here. You'll see that I now have a capture image that I can create. When I deploy this, just like I did before creating an advertisement, it's going to make all those changes. It's going to install the operating system and do everything it needs to, and then suck all that stuff back in to create a new WIM image that I can then deploy later on. It'll end up here into my operating system images, and then I can now deploy that just like I would before by creating a new task sequence. And so you can see the process here is relatively scriptable, and therefore it's relatively repeatable and very extensible in what you can do to it. It eliminates the requirement for you to spend a lot of time manually going through and creating your own golden images and keeping them separated from regular images and wasting workstations because you want to keep those separated as well. And so this really concludes the majority of the processes that you need to know in order to successfully use operating system deployment within Configuration Manager. And so we've talked about all the bits and pieces that really need to link together appropriately. There's a lot of different things that have to correctly mesh together for this to function properly. But you're probably wondering at this point, well, Greg, you showed me all the server side pieces, but you haven't really showed me what goes on the client. You haven't really showed me what goes on whenever the client attempts to actually complete the operating system update. And so let's actually take a look at that here. I've actually taken Nugget 1, which is our little workstation client here, and actually booted in with some bootable media. And we've brought up here WinPE. WinPE using one of the boot images that we talked about earlier. You'll see here we have the task sequence wizard that we've brought up here, and we have one button here that allows us to configure the networking information if DHCP does not give us the proper networking information for WinPE. Once we're ready to go, we can hit the next button, and this task sequence wizard will go look out to the Configuration Manager server to see what's actually been assigned to it. Before we do that, actually, I want to go back to our Configuration Manager server here and talk about this task sequence that we created, this deploy vanilla Vista task sequence that we created. What I actually did was right-clicked and chose to advertise this to a collection that Nugget 1 actually exists in. And so if I actually go here to Software Distribution and Advertisements, you'll see that deploy vanilla Vista, the task sequence, is currently being deployed to a collection that Nugget 1 is currently a member of. And so actually when we attempt to go to Nugget 1 and boot, whether that be boot through the client or boot through the bootable media or however we actually boot to that location, once we boot to that location and click the next button here, as you'll see, it's going to begin to look for the available policies that have been assigned to this computer. You'll see that it's found that deploy vanilla Vista policy here, and it's actually going to run that policy here in about 8 seconds or so. And once that policy begins to run, it's going to go look to the server and begin pulling down the information it needs from the server to actually begin the process of building this client. You'll see now it's resolving some dependencies. It's going to go then begin this process of partitioning the disks, of actually downloading the OS information, installing the OS information, any of the post-installation stuff that we've configured. And once we're done, this system will be exactly as we've configured it inside of that task sequence. And so this is really what it looks like on the client. The client is very little for us to do on the client, but it really, really speeds up the process once we have all those scripted actions that we want to create here inside of task sequences. So what have we talked about today? We've talked about deploying operating systems. We talked about how you can use WinPE and to help you actually push and pull WIM files off of clients. We talked about the boot, the install, and the capture images that are associated with each of the 3 steps that are involved with actually getting images on onto clients, making those configurations, and then pulling them back into our configuration manager to deploy them to other locations on our environment. We talked about task sequences and how you can do some very unique and very cool things inside of task sequences to very specifically control the configuration of how you deploy those OS images. And then we also talked about Pixie and how you can use Pixie in this Pixie Site System role to work with clients that don't necessarily have the configuration manager client installed to them. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.